The Trumpet Daily with Stephen Flurry.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to the Trumpet Daily radio show. We're here, the last show of the week, another fast-moving week, even though it's been pretty quiet around Edstone. Our caravan coming back from the Alps should be here at any time. Perhaps I'll see it even pulling up the drive as we carry on with this live broadcast. We had some fun last night. Sam and I saw the Aston Villa game in Birmingham. My wife actually joined us at the last minute. And our local team here, our local football club, even though thoroughly outplayed, somehow managed to pull out a victory. So we'll see if they're able to stay in the Premier League. They just got in last year, and they're pretty far down on the table. So who knows? Speaking of Birmingham, we've got the Birmingham Pack coming up on February 1st and 2nd. That's just a little over a month away. So far, we have 57 people registered for Birmingham, and on the 22nd of February, we've got the Belfast Pack coming up as well. We got this email in today from someone in the Netherlands. He says, I have a ticket for Belfast for the first time for me to see someone of the PCG. I'm from the Netherlands, so it's a little trip for me. So we'll be excited to meet that individual. His first opportunity to meet with members of the Philadelphia Church of God. So that's very exciting. The numbers, of course, we've still got 4, 5, 6 weeks to go. So hopefully the numbers will increase over the next few weeks. 57, though, so far registered for Birmingham, and 38 for Belfast. I thought I should mention also, Joel Hilliker wrote about this in his Trumpet Brief earlier this week, the 30-year anniversary of the Philadelphia Trumpet magazine. Of course, we had a lot to say about the 30-year anniversary of the Philadelphia Church of God, back on December 7th. We're coming up to January 16th, of course. And with respect to the Trumpet magazine, our anniversary issue, it goes back to February of, 1990. Yeah, 30 years. So we're coming up to the anniversary edition of that Trumpet magazine. If you remember the chronology there, some of you, the church started with just the 12 people on December 7th. Then on January the 16th, or a few days before the 16th, that's when we sent out those Malachi's messages, the first batch of Malachi's message. And then it was the following month when we started the Trumpet magazine. And of course, back then, the Trumpet was just a little, I think, 7 or 8 page newsletter. So it's come a long way over the years. The beautiful cover that we have on this anniversary issue has to do with the protests that are sweeping across the world. The age of protest, as it says there on your screen, if you're watching the YouTube stream. Mr. Hilliker, in his Trumpet Brief, he refers to the article that my father has in this upcoming anniversary edition, a look at the work behind this unique news magazine. That'll be his personal. But there's also quite a lot in the entirety of the issue about government, man's forms of government, and he's had lots of them. We had a program on that just a couple of weeks ago, I think. But you'll see in this anniversary edition that man's governments just haven't worked, and of course there will be solutions in this forthcoming issue as well. Speaking of government, we'll go back to, at the end of the program, we'll go back to the foundation of this world, taking us again to the book of Genesis chapter 9, chapter 10. I don't know how far we'll get into chapter 11. But this coming out of the flood, this really and truly was the foundation of the present evil world as we see it today. So that's coming up in the second segment. For this segment, we've got the news, the significant news. Donald Trump wins in a landslide. That's big news. A landslide, according to a new poll coming out of Germany. Donald Trump is hands down the most dangerous man in the world. That's right. He's the most dangerous man on earth. Germans were asked who is the biggest threat to world peace, and Mr. Trump won that survey by a margin of 41%. There he is, the most dangerous man in the world. 41% say ordinary Germans. He poses the greatest threat to this world. In second place is Kim Jong-un at 16%. Vladimir Putin is 8%. The Ayatollah in Iran is 8%. So you've got Putin and Khamenei tied for third. And then the Chinese dictator, Xi Jinping, he got 7%. So 41% for the billionaire real estate mogul. And then second place is 16%. And then 8, and 7. So there you have it. The President of the United States winning in a landslide. This world really and truly is. I guess the one positive you can take away from this survey is that at least there are people that are aware of a dangerous world. It's just that the way they view it, if they only knew where the greatest dangers will come from. Speaking of President Trump, he, just as an aside here, he had, I guess they were playing Home Alone 2. He made a cameo in that movie. I've never seen that movie, but evidently he made a cameo in the movie, and it was played in Canada on a Canadian broadcast of some kind. And his cameo was cut from the movie, so the Canadian broadcaster just cut it out of the movie, and then said later, well, we had to make room for commercials. That's the excuse. And President Trump had some fun with that on his Twitter feed. He said that the movie's never going to be the same since his little cameo was cut out of it. And then he also said this: I guess Justin Trudeau doesn't much like me making him pay up on NATO or trade. So he took a little bit of a shot there at the Canadian Prime Minister. On a more serious note, there's just switching back to Germany. Deutsche Welle had an article on the German president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier. He said earlier this week, we're in the midst of the 75-year anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge. We'll have more to say on that, I think, as we get into the month of January. We're doing some research on it now. But since we're going through this anniversary, the German president, the lesson that he takes away from that World War II era is that we've got to have a united Europe. We've learned the lessons of extreme nationalism. That's his takeaway from World War II. Steinmeier said earlier this week, a united and peaceful Europe, that's the lesson that we Europeans have learned from unbridled nationalism and racism, from the War of Annihilation. That's the lessons that we Germans have learned. The Europeans, in fact, have learned this. Unbridled nationalism. And so the solution? Well, we need 10 kings, if you can use the language of the Bible for a moment. That's exactly what he's saying. We need the kings of Europe to come together. And of course, Germany's the dominant player. Germany's the lead nation. No one can question that. No one doubts that. He said here, please don't let us forget that, especially at a moment when nationalism and ethnocentric thinking are again regaining their allure. And so they would say, well, see, that's what's happening in the United States. And so that's the danger. That's the real problem. But we Europeans, we're all going to come together. And what happens when human beings or organizations of this world, what happens when they come together in a grand alliance? Well, look at all of them. Look at how they've failed miserably, every one of them. Herbert Armstrong's made this point before, or he did years ago in some of his writings. that anytime man makes an attempt or an effort to bring the nations together or to bring organizations together, it's always a spectacular failure. We know from what your Bible prophesies, those 10 kings are going to come together, and that, as it happens, represents the greatest danger, the greatest threat to this earth. One more side note here since I mentioned politics briefly. This was a headline from AP News. Israel's embattled Netanyahu. He wins a landslide in his primary. Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Thursday scored a landslide victory in a primary race for leadership of the ruling Likud party. So he's in a situation, he's fighting for his political life, of course. He has a lot of enemies. The other side, the Israeli deep state, as we covered earlier this week, they want to destroy him. But here, his own party, the Likud party, well, they give him strong support. He enjoys enthusiastic support from his base. There's some parallels there, as I noted earlier this week. You can look at some parallels between Netanyahu and what's happening here in the UK and, of course, the United States. President Trump right now, he's probably enjoying stronger support from the Republican Party than he ever has. There was that article that we went through earlier this week, that 2019 will go down as the year that Donald Trump gained control of the Republican Party. He's calling the shots. And it's not because he's imposing his will and everyone's terrified because of him, as was suggested by Chris Cuomo on CNN last night. It's because there's a lot of people that actually like what he's doing. They actually like him. Listen to Cuomo last night. He's talking with the Republican strategist, Sean Duffy, and speaking about President Trump's popularity with his base. Clip 3.
Fear is powerful in politics. My suggestion is that this president scares people in your party. Not like I'm going to hurt you, nothing thuggish. I will beat you if you go against me. I will come where you live and I will run someone against you. I will come to where you are toe for toe and you will lose like Sanford did. Is that the pull for people?
No. So I think you're absolutely wrong, Chris. I think people don't gravitate towards Donald Trump because they fear him. They gravitate towards him because they love him. They love the policies that he's fighting for. We're a party of lifers. We believe in life, not late-term partial birth abortions. We believe in secure borders. We believe in fair trade. We believe in limited government. Donald Trump has fought for all those things, and that's why people love him. No one's afraid of him.
They like him, his supporters. And more, the Republicans in the House and the Senate. I went through that article, remember, in 2019, the year he gained control of the Republican Party. And early on, there was a lot of resistance, even within his own party. Now, there's still a few, obviously, here and there. There's always a few exceptions. But for the most part, they love him, as Duffy brought out in that exchange. They love what he's doing. They love that he's following through on his campaign promises. So many of them. That's very unusual. As far as politicians go, they love the fact that he's good for the economy. Look at the stock market yesterday. The NASDAQ surpassed 9,000 for the first time in its history. CNBC said that President Donald Trump's stock market stacks up well against the majority of his presidential predecessors. He's doing better than any of his predecessors. The S&P is at an all-time high. It's returned more than 50% since Donald Trump was elected. In 3 years, that's been the return on the S&P. Listen to CNBC yesterday as they talk about the booming stock market. Clip 1.
As you can see from the bottom of your screen, that the NASDAQ has hit 9,000 for the first time ever. Comes after hitting 8,000 in August of 2018. And, of course, now the countdown can begin to NASDAQ 10K, Mike.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you remember, NASDAQ 5,000 was the landmark in the year 2000. So it's not quite doubled that, while the S&P has, in fact, well over doubled its previous all-time high. So this shows you where recently the strength has been in the market, but it's been a long comeback.
A long comeback. It's been a wild ride. Paul Krugman, he's the highly esteemed economist at the New York Times. He wrote after Donald Trump was elected that the market, the stock market, would never recover. That's what Krugman said at the New York Times. It would never recover because Donald Trump's going to be so bad for the economy. The stock markets would never, ever, ever be able to recover. Since Krugman wrote that, the Dow Jones Index has gained 10,000 points. 10,000? 10,000 points just since 3 years ago. Now, as I've been covering of late, we're also taking on record levels of debt. So the party is not going to go on forever. The Wall Street Journal noted recently, says the Treasury Department auctioned 7-year notes Thursday, closing the door on a record year for sales of longer-term debt in 2019. They sell these bonds to pay for the skyrocketing debt. Listen to this. It says the auction lifted the total of notes and bonds sold by the U.S. government with maturities ranging from 2 to 30 years to $2.55 trillion, a 26% increase from 2017 when Congress and President Trump agreed to massive corporate tax cuts. So those cuts have done something to stimulate the economy for sure. And you see it in the stock market and such. But underlying all of this, there's a massive accumulation of debt. And we've got to keep our eyes on that because that's the reality for our future, for our children, for their children, if time were to go on long enough. But in the short term, there's obviously a resurgence. There's obviously some successes we're seeing with respect to this president following through on his promises. And this, of course, is why his enemies hate him so much. This is why he comes under such fierce attack, a constant barrage. Back in October, and we missed this because we were at the Feast of Tabernacles, but President Trump gave a speech at the Values Voter Summit. I'm not sure where that was, somewhere in the States, but it was in October 12th, and he talked about what the radical left, he came on really strong, and he also talked quite a lot about God and the backing he enjoyed from people of faith. But listen to what he said from October. This goes back a couple of months, but there's some pretty strong quotes in this speech that I think went on for more than an hour. Here's clip 4.
It's a terrible thing going on in this country. But they're using that call to impeach your president who won in 2016, perhaps the greatest election of our time. And I won it for you. I didn't win it for me. I won it for you and others, but I won it for you. They're coming after me because I'm fighting for you. That's a big part of it. And I'm fighting for all Americans and our way of life, but I'm fighting for you. And they don't like you. They don't like you. And you explain why. You explain why. Your values are so incredible. They don't like you.
That's Donald Trump from October 12th. It's interesting when you listen to him. I was just thinking of this as he was talking there. You compare his worldview, or even just his domestic view, with Chris Cuomo. Chris Cuomo in that exchange I played earlier. He's like, well, this is my theory, that people are scared of him. And so they submit to his will, or else he's going to come after him. And here's the president. Now, some would say he's an elitist too. He's a billionaire. He's lived in New York his whole life. And yet he knows Who's more in touch with reality? Just comparing these two high-profile individuals, the CNN anchor and then the president, who said, look, the reason they're coming after me, the reason they attack me is because they hate you. They hate what you stand for. They hate that you like me. They hate that we're succeeding. Listen here to what he went on to say, clip 5.
And as we've seen in the last 3 years, the extreme left has absolutely no respect for the will of the American people. They are determined to stop our movement and impose their agenda by any means necessary. It makes no difference to them.
Any means necessary. Pulling out all the stops. Just destroy the path of destruction. And everything that they do to try to take down this president. He talked again about some of their shared values, and listen to, again, him invoke all of these, the Declaration, the great creator God, God Almighty. This is clip 6.
Our shared values are under assault like never before. Extreme left-wing radicals, both inside and outside government, are determined to shred our Constitution and eradicate the beliefs we all cherish. Far-left socialists are trying to tear down the traditions and customs that made America the greatest nation on earth. They reject the principles of our founding fathers, principles enshrined into the Declaration of Independence, which proclaims that our rights come from our Creator. But despite the delusions of the radical left, all of us here today know that our rights come from God Almighty, and they can never be taken away.
That's President Trump from October, as I say, October 12th at the Values Voter Summit. Speaking of the great creator God and that our values come from him, and he enjoys overwhelming support from the evangelical community, as we've said so many times before. There was that column, what was it, Christianity Today, I think, that came out and said that he should be impeached. And Donald Trump responded to that saying, that's just another left-wing rag, even though it's supposedly a Christian organization. It's a tool of the left. And then he gets all of this support from the religious community. Strong support. We have an upcoming article in the Trumpet, or the trumpet.com. I think it's going to be posted Monday. Nearly 200 evangelical leaders defend Trump and condemn Christianity Today. And the article talks about how the support is still up over 80%. And he pulled in that percentage of the vote, the evangelical vote. It was higher than George W. Bush. This is the King's Chapel. This is a religious movement in so many ways. And this is yet another reason why his enemies hate him, because they see his past, they look at his sins, and they think, well, how can the traditional world of Christianity support him of all people? Well, that individual is fighting against a very evil force, as my father wrote about in America Under Attack and Great Again, of course. A couple more clips from the speech he gave back in October, the president, clip 7.
To the radical left, together we will stand up to the socialists, and we will win massive victories for family, for faith, and for freedom, just like the victory we had in 2016.
And as my father has said, to see him stand against it or to fight against it, it's something to behold. These people, so many of them, are deranged in their thinking. He He said in this final clip that they're crazy. Listen to this, clip 8.
The hateful spirit that consumes the modern left violates every tenet of the American tradition. The radical left tolerates no dissent. It permits no opposition. It accepts no compromise. And look, we have all seen it. We see what's going on. There is no compromise. Frankly, these people are crazy. They're crazy. They are crazy. I shouldn't say it because we're all the same, but they are crazy.
That's President Trump in October. I shouldn't say it. We're all Americans, but they are crazy. This is a crazy movement. There's been a five-part series in the Washington Post, surprisingly, about Rachel Maddow, the MSNBC host, who was out front with the dossier, the dirty dossier, a little less than 3 years ago, talking about how that more and more of it was being revealed. It's been corroborated. It's true. The FBI wouldn't have used it were it not the truth. She was leading the way, and now, because of the Horowitz report, this op-ed author, his name's Eric Wemple, he's writing at the Washington Post. The Washington Post is probably trying to save face to some degree. But there hasn't been nearly enough of this. Individuals calling out the ones that were out there espousing the lies. Every night on TV, every day in the morning newspaper. They just took the dossier and ran with it. It was all coordinated by the very top officials of the Obama administration, the ones that now work at CNN and MSNBC. Collusion, all of them colluding together. This Washington Post op-ed, it says here, the Horowitz team didn't attempt an independent fact check of the dossier, opting instead to report what the FBI had concluded about the document. Just took the FBI's own conclusions. Unflattering revelations pop up at every turn in the 400-page report. Every single page. It says here, this is quoting the report, according to an FBI official during an interview in May 2017, the primary subsource, this is for the dossier, said the corroboration was 0. There was no corroboration. And as I've covered in the program here the last week or two, the FBI knew this. They knew that the case was breaking down just as soon as it got started. They knew it in January of 2017. And that's right around the time, once it came out on BuzzFeed and all that, that's right around the time that the media, they ran with it. Including, out front, Rachel Maddow. It says the ubiquity of Horowitz's debunking passages suggests that he wanted the public to come away with the impression that the dossier was a flabby, hasty, precipitous, conclusory charade of a document. Viewers of certain MSNBC fare were surely blindsided by the news if they ever even heard it. He goes back and says what Maddow had been saying in 2017, and then he even says, then more recently, when the Horowitz report comes out, she's off on other things. It says, name a host on cable news who has dug more deeply into Trump Russia than MSNBC's Rachel Maddow. He quotes from her in the January 13th, 2017 program, saying that this has been released. Obviously, the FBI has looked into this. It wouldn't release it were it not the truth. It can't be trash. It can't be based on flimsy evidence or our distinguished the FBI, the DOJ, the intelligence community. Surely they wouldn't have used it. Well, Rachel Maddow, of course, wasn't alone in reporting this, as several montages of late have noted. They all ran with this story. Here's one montage put together by Grabian, clip 2.
Parts of the now infamous dossier on Trump have proven to be true.
Your intel community has corroborated all of the details in there.
When the president just refers to it as fake dossier, that is false.
I don't think that is the accurate characterization.
Investigators have corroborated part of the dossier.
We do know that parts of it have been corroborated.
It's not been corroborated, but it hasn't been disproven.
No major thing from the dossier has been conclusively disproven.
To date, none of it has been disproven, and whole big parts of it are holding up.
The dossier holds up well.
It's a fact that none of it, not one word, has been disproven. In fact, a lot of it turned out to be right on the money.
The FBI would not have just taken a dossier to the FISA court and used that as their predicate for the surveillance. They had to corroborate it themselves. That's how they operate.
That's how the FBI operates. They don't make mistakes. Victor Davis Hanson had a piece earlier this week about James Comey, Andy McCabe, John Brennan, James Clapper. He says, what do these guys all have in common? Well, they obviously were all top officials in the Obama administration. He says they ran the nation's key intelligence and investigatory agencies under President Barack Obama, and they were all on board with the Russia collusion hoax. They were out there promoting it. It was John Brennan and Clapper and the others that were pushing it. They were all involved in those final meetings with Obama, then President Trump, or President-elect Trump. They put the hook out there. CNN dutifully ran with it. And then BuzzFeed followed and printed the entirety of that salacious document filled with lies. Getting back to these former Obama officials, what do they have in common? Well, number 2 here, Victor Davis Hanson says, Comey, McCabe, Brennan, and Clapper have all lied either under oath or in the public sphere. And he goes on and talks about their lies. Their lies to the public. Their lies, in some cases, under oath. What do they have in common? All 4 of these former intelligence chiefs detest the President of the United States. And he talks about some of the things that they have said about this president. He's guilty of treason. He's disgusting, one said. He's like a mafia boss. These are high-ranking officials in the former administration. These are individuals that headed up the institutions of the FBI, the DOJ, etc., etc. What do they have in common? It says all of them in their post-Obama administration careers are either paid cable news analysts or frequent guest commentators. You see the collusion? Hanson says in the most controversial stories, Brennan, Clapper, and McCabe are being paid to analyze theories, facts, and findings in which they themselves are often central players. It's just a big hoax. In some, Hanson says, we're witnessing a surreal collusion between the nation's former top intelligence officials and the progressive media beyond even the nightmares of so-called conspiracy theorists. That's what they are, really. That's what Rachel Maddow is. Conspiracy theorist. It says, finally, just switching back to this Washington Post 5-part series on Rachel Maddow and how that she took the dossier and was promoting it every night. It's the truth. It says, on the day Horowitz released his punishing report with all its assertions about the dossier's dubiety, Maddow chose not to focus on the integrity of the document that she'd once claimed was accumulating credibility on a near daily basis. She said this is quoting her, the Inspector General debunks that there was any anti-Trump political bias motivating these decisions. They debunked the idea that the Christopher Steele dossier of opposition research against Trump was the basis for opening the FBI's Russia investigation. It absolutely was not. And oh, by the way, no, there was no spying on the Trump campaign. So she just carries on with her narrative, unrepentant, no remorse for deceiving people. Just continuing right on. It says the case against Maddow is far stronger. When small bits of news arose in favor of the dossier, the franchise MSNBC host pumped air into them. At least some of her many fans surely came away from her broadcast thinking the dossier was a serious piece of investigative research, not the flim-flam, quick-twitch game of telephone outlined in the Horowitz report. She was rooting for the document, it says. She was there, and the point of his article is she was there for the bunkings, absent for the debunkings. She was there to promote the lies, and then when it was fully exposed as a fraud, then they go missing. That's what we've been seeing the last several years. Now it's beginning to be exposed because of this man that you heard earlier, President Trump, who is fighting back against these, in some cases, crazy people, deranged people, obsessed people, evil people. When we come back, speaking of evil people, we'll look at some personalities in the early part of Genesis that played a significant role in establishing the supposedly distinguished institutions of our present world. You're listening to Stephen Flurry, and this is the Trumpet Daily radio show. We'll be right back.
This is KPCG-FM, and this is the Trumpet Daily.
The developed nations have made awesome progress. They have produced a highly mechanized world, providing every luxury, modern convenience, and means of pleasure. Yet they are cursed with crime, violence, injustice, sickness and disease, broken homes and families. At the same time, more than one-half the world is living in illiteracy, abject poverty, filth and squalor. Violence and destruction are rapidly multiplying. Many ask, why, if God exists, does he allow so much violence and human suffering? To understand the reason behind this astonishing paradox, request a complimentary copy of Mystery of the Ages. We were born into this 20th century world as it is. We take it for granted, but we can't explain it. It's like viewing a movie at a point already near the end. We see what is occurring at that point, but not having seen it from the beginning and not knowing how events developed to the point of viewing, we simply cannot understand what we are seeing. Mystery of the Ages transports you back to the beginning of the movie, to the foundation of this present evil world.
To learn more, please visit thetrumpet.com. From the Philadelphia Church of God campus in Edstone, England, this is the Trumpet Daily program with Stephen Flurry.
I've said so many times, it's like coming into a movie when it's about 90-95% finished, and you don't know what went before, you don't know what events led up to what you're seeing in the movie now, and consequently you don't understand what's going on when you see the movie if you didn't see it from the beginning. The beginning always sets the foundation for the whole thing.
There is a foundation to this present evil world. That's what Paul calls it in Galatians 1 and verse 4. And what is that foundation? Well, you read about it in the chapters that follow the life of Noah, the flood of Noah's day, and what happened right after the flood waters subsided. It says in verse 1 of Genesis 9, and God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. And so the world had been purged. And this one family, Noah's family, could go out and be fruitful and multiply, just as God had said to Adam and Eve originally. But these were 8 people that had a chance to start anew, to start fresh for about 100 years, a century or so following the flood. The human family, for the most part, dwelt in the high ground in and around where the flood had settled, somewhere in the mountainous region of what's today modern Turkey. But after man started to spread out a little bit and to colonize, they ran into some trouble. Josephus records this history. It says, God also commanded them to send colonies abroad for the thorough peopling of the earth, that they might not raise seditions among themselves, but might cultivate a great part of the earth and enjoy its fruits after a plentiful manner. But they were so ill-instructed. That they did not obey God. Josephus suggests that this was a little more than 100 years after the ark settled on Mount Ararat. Here they renounced God's revelation, God's leadership, God's truth, and of course turned to or looked to leaders who were evil and corrupt. I just want to go through this incident in the end of chapter 9 with Noah and his grandson, just because of the impact that this has had on world affairs. You can read in the middle part of the chapter, God gave man the authority to execute murderers. Cain, of course, was sent away after murdering his brother. But after the flood, God said, if you shed an innocent man's blood, then you ought to be put to death. And then he establishes his covenant with the family of Noah that there wouldn't be another flood to destroy the earth, a worldwide flood. But then down in verse 20 of Genesis 9, it says, and Noah began to be an husbandman, and he planted a vineyard, and he drank the wine, and was drunk, and was uncovered within his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his 2 brothers without, and Shem and Japheth, took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders, and went backward and covered the nakedness of their father. And their faces were backward, and they saw not their father's nakedness. And Noah awoke from his wine, and knew what his younger son had done unto him. And he said, cursed be Canaan, his younger son, meaning his grandson. So Canaan did something, and Noah cursed him for it. It says, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. This is an explanation of this passage from the Good News magazine, February of 1980. It says, after the grape harvest and winemaking was over one fall, Noah was guilty of celebrating a bit too much. He became drunk from the wine and passed out in his tent, probably in the company of Canaan, his grandson. Later, Ham entered the tent and found Noah alone, but lying naked on the bed. He immediately told Shem and Japheth, who covered their father with a blanket. So we just read that at the end of Genesis 9. It says, and when Noah awoke out of his stupor, he realized what his grandson had done to him, some sort of sexual dishonor, and placed a curse on Canaan and his descendants. He gave Shem the birthright and declared that Canaan would be a servant to both Shem and Japheth. And true to his prophetic blessing and curse, Shem's future descendants, of course, Israel would come from them, conquered and enslaved the progeny of Canaan at the hand of Joshua. So really, it's an incredible prophecy that had a real world impact on human civilization, even through to this day. Now, today we're seeing a world in turmoil and things flip-flopping here at the end, the times of the Gentiles. We're heading into those times, as we know. But what an impact this had on the affairs of mankind for thousands of years. Well, we're talking about the foundation, the very beginning. Verse 28 in Genesis 9 says, "And Noah lived after the flood 350 years. And all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died." This is something that really amazes me. You think of Noah, you think of the days before the flood, and then, of course, you think of the flood. And then after the flood is over, you don't really think of Noah, but the Bible says he was alive for 350 years after that, for more than 3 centuries. So what an opportunity for human civilization to look to this great patriarch, to obey his teachings. This was a man of God, a preacher of righteousness. And yet how quickly man turned away from God's truth and started to do his own thing and started to build and to establish his society under the sway and influence of the devil, of course, the god of this world. That same article I just quoted from says Noah was greatly beloved of God, a rare man who had walked with God in 2 different worlds, pre and post flood. He was on the other side of the flood, and then he was on this side. 350 years of it. He bridged the 2 worlds, you could say. If only human civilization would have looked to that very recent history of the flood and to Noah's powerful example of faith and obedience to God. Verse 1 of chapter 10, it says, "Now these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and unto them were sons born after the flood." So all of humanity came from these 3 families. All the races, the different races in human civilization, sprung from these 3. Verse 6, it says, "And the sons of Ham, Cush, and Mizraim, and Phut, and Canaan." So Cush was the oldest son of Ham, and we've been introduced to Canaan already, and the curse that God put upon him. Verse 7, it says, "And the sons of Cush, Seba and Havilah," all these names. "Cush begat Nimrod," it says in verse 8. "And he began to be a mighty one in the earth." So if you look at chapter 10, it's pretty much a chapter devoted to genealogies, except when you come to Nimrod. This is significant, God is telling us. This is important. I've got to put in a few more details here with respect to Nimrod, because this was an evil human being. It's a brief account, but what God gives us is critically important. Nimrod comes from the Hebrew word harad, and it means to rebel. That's what his name meant, to rebel. And this was an individual who rebelled against God. It says in verse 8 that he began to be a mighty one in the earth. Everybody knew about Nimrod. Everybody looked to Nimrod, for the most part, more than they did to Noah. They looked to Nimrod, this mighty hunter, a mighty one in the earth. If you study that word mighty in the Hebrew, it can also mean tyrant. So this was the first despotic leader following the flood. Verse 9 says he was a mighty hunter before the Eternal, Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the eternal. God repeats himself there. This was someone who put himself in place of God. That's the meaning there, of putting, of before the eternal. He was a mighty individual, a tyrant, a despot, a mighty hunter. In Mystery of the Ages, Mr. Armstrong says, Nimrod, as recorded in chapter 4 of this book, made a virtual god of himself. He made a god of himself. You can think back to, what was it, last week or maybe earlier this week, Genesis 4 there, where Eve, when she conceived and had a son, her firstborn son, Cain, she made a god out of that son as well. Of course, Nimrod is closely associated with his mother/wife, Semiramis. And you get this perverse and what would become a very religious arrangement between a mother and a son. And that persists to this day. Verse 10, it says, in the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. This is speaking of Nimrod. Babel and Erech and Akkad and Calneh, all in the land of Shinar. So he was famous for building these cities, these great cities, city-states. And the Tower of Babel, which is the subject of chapter 11. You talk about an open, defiant act of rebellion against God, building up this massive city, well fortified. Nimrod and his supporters thinking that this would make them more powerful than God himself. Chapter 11 says, and the whole earth was of one language and one speech. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. So human civilization is growing. The family of man is expanding. And God, of course, as that quote even from Josephus brings out, God had given them some clear instructions about how to colonize, about how to build for God. But they didn't want to do it God's way. They wanted to do it their way. Verse 3 says, and they said one to another, go, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. So they put together this artificial substance to build with. This was their substitute, you could say, for God's creation. Verse 4, and they said, go and let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto the heaven, and let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Let's do it for us. We don't want to be scattered again. Let's all come together. We have a big idea here, a big plan to bring everyone together under Nimrod's dictatorial leadership, we should add. But this was the plan. Unity. Togetherness. It all sounds so good. It just never works unless we're following God's direction, seeking God's guidance. Verse 5, it says, and the Eternal came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded. And the Eternal said, behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. And so God had to put the brakes on man's attempt to build a civilization, because they were getting into evil so fast, and it was spreading so fast that God had to intervene just to slow it down. It says, go to, verse 7, let us go down and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Eternal scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth. And they left off to build the city. Therefore, the name of it is called Babel, because the Eternal did there confound the language of all the earth. and from thence did the Eternal scatter them abroad upon the face of the earth. Babel means confusion. The name Nimrod means to rebel. Rebellion and confusion. And that's what we see in the world today. Someone was, it was Richard who sent me a paragraph of one of the commentators, the analysts that we read often. We love getting his take on world events, world news. But he was just describing his religious background, and I thought, I've never read anything more confused and twisted in my life. The influences he came from, his wife, I mean, it's nothing, as far as this world goes, it was completely normal. But there's something for everyone in this world. What a confused and in so many ways chaotic world it is. Confusion and rebellion. You advance forward to the very days we're in right now, and it all sprung from Babel. The Bible at the very end talks about coming out of Babylon. Well, maybe next week we can talk more about that pagan Babylonian system. That's all that we have time for, though, on today's program. You're listening to Stephen Fleury, and this is the Trumpet Daily Radio Show. We thank you for joining us on today's show. Thanks for joining us all week, and we'll see you next week.